All right, good morning and welcome back. So there's a couple of things we're going to talk about, and if you notice on our schedule, I'll drag that over real quickly, I extended it out all the way to the 27th because we have a lot of new things to talk about, and they do get a little convoluted. The other thing that is happening next week is the high school business contest, and while it's not on the day for this class, it does kind of impact some of our other activities, so we're running around a little bit. So I just thought we'd stretch it out a little bit and then make sure everybody is on board with where we're at. So up until now, all of our programs have kind of ran straight through. So they've had a logical sequence that said from A to point Z, and we go straight through this. Well, that's handy, and our computer's really good at that. But what our computer is even better about doing is doing things repetitively. And so we're going to introduce you to the idea of something called a loop so that we can do things repetitively over and over and over again. And that's where our computer is a lot better than we are as people. So to a degree, we need repetition for practice, but after a while, so Brian's over here in the corner and getting ready to go to baseball practice. So at some point, you go from, at a batting practice, for example, from, hey, I'm getting better, to, I can't even pick the bat up, my arms are so tired. But a computer, it could do 20,000 times, and it's going to do it exactly the same way every time. So it's one of the advantages that our computers have over us as people. So I've got a lot of resources in here, and I want to show you about a couple of different things. So in Blackboard, I actually have included a link to another book also. So this is a book we've used before in this class. It's kind of out of print, a little older, but I think it does a really good job of a couple of things. And one of them, if I can get it to launch in the window here. So it's going to launch this book here, and it does a really nice job of the branching and the loops. So if you get confused, this might be another good place to go and look at those. So it goes through, and this one does something interesting in that it builds everything around games. And so we're actually going to do this Guess My Number game and take a look at it in this class, even though we're not using that book. So it is available, and it's got some interesting pieces in here that we're going to talk about. All right. So there's a lot of other pieces. You need to make sure you watch the videos, read the material. So this is where we start to add a little bit of complication, and we're adding these loops. So there's two basic types of loops. And the first type is if we need it to do a set number. So it's called a definitive loop. In other words, if I have a loop that says start loop, print, hello, and then repeat loop 20 times end. So this is what we call a definitive loop. And no, that is not coded correctly for Python. But what it does is it says, hey, we're gonna print hello, we're gonna do it 20 times, and then we're gonna end our program. Okay? So that's that idea of a definitive loop. An indefinite loop works slightly different. So what I'd like to think about this is the indefinite loop is really something like a thermometer. So our thermostat on the wall, so we'll even just call this thermostat. If I can spell it all today. All right. So we're going to start our loop. And so there's going to be some kind of check. So check if temperature greater than required. So in this case, it's a heat-only system. It's the middle of winter. So if the temperature is higher than required, do we need to do anything? No. So maybe we need to look at it a little differently. And let's say this. So check if temperature is less than required, then we turn on heat. And then we repeat. So we start that loop back up again. And that loop runs continually, and as long as that temperature is less than required, it continues to keep the heat on. So that's really how these thermostats work in our life, is as long as that temperature is below our set point, it's going to continue to run that heat. So that's an idea of an indefinite loop. Something else can get us out of that loop, but we don't know what yet that is, but we run it until it needs to stop. So we call that an indefinite loop, or so definitive loop, indefinite loop. So our book likes to call them iteration. It really means the same thing. We're repeating something several times. So I like to do this piece of, or a way to do a loop last, because I think it's kind of a shortcut. This book starts it out first, so just be aware of that. So these are something called a for loop. And a for loop says, for X number of passes, or X number of loops, I'm going to run that as a loop. So for, and here's our variable, in a range. So we could actually say 4 times. So sometimes this is where it's handy to break out that idle and actually just look at it and see if we can make something very similar. So for, and notice it orange codes it for us. So here if we use the same thing, each pass in range 4, and notice there's something going to be a little weird with this one. So now I have to put in some punctuation. And I put in a colon. And when I do that, even when I hit enter, notice it jumps down a line. And, oh, that's kind of weird. Print. So I'm going to shortcut that just a little bit. So this one says for each pass in range of 4, it's alive. Okay, well, let's see when I run this. So it doesn't even let me come back out of here to run this. And I don't like, because notice I had to tab backwards. Well, there it goes. It's alive, it's alive, it's alive, it's alive. So mine came out slightly different just because I didn't add the end and combine them together. But it certainly ran 4 times. But in this shell, that's not very useful to me, because in that shell, it's hard for me to repeat things. So I like to come in here and go File, New, and I'm going to open up a new program here. So I need to make sure that I'm going to save this in the right spot. So first I'm going to put in a couple comments. And so one of the items you may have noticed on your assignment is I said make sure you put in your name and what assignment it is. So this one's a practice. And I need to find a place to save this. So before I can do anything else with it, I have to be able to save it in here. So I'm going to click Save As, and I'm going to navigate to my Python folder where I'm saving things, and I'm going to call this Loop 1, just so I know what it is. And so now, I'm going to do this very similar type of statement, but I'm going to do it inside of my batch coding, if you want to think about it that way. So for each pass in range 5, and notice when I hit that colon, when I come back in, it indents it. This is one of those critical things that Python does, is it works with the idea of indents to create blocks. And I'll show you what I mean by that here in just a second. Print. It's alive. All right. So notice as I come down here, I'm also, all of this is inside of a block. And everything that's at this indent level is considered part of this. So I could have another print statement. I'm just going to put a blank line in there. All of these things at this level are now considered a block. So if I go back out and I put in my input into program, this is all considered a block. And I could have it as long as I wanted in here. I can put in white space in there. This entire block is part of that loop that runs. So if I wanted to check that a little bit, I could even create a variable that lives inside of here. And so I'm just going to call this one x because we don't really need it for anything. So x equals x plus 1. So every time that this loop goes through, it's going to add a variable to x, well, a number 1 to it. And so at the end of my program, I just want x. I'm going to print out how many times this thing looped. And so let's take a look and see how this works. So I'm going to click run. And when I do that, it's going to want to make sure that in the right spot, that I have to save it again. So, and it's going to give me an error. And it says x is not defined. Okay. Easy enough. Let's look at our code. For each pass in range 5, so up here, I could simply say x is equal to 0. So now I've got a value in there. So it's alive, it's alive, it's alive, it's alive. All right, so it printed 5 times, and it gave me the number 5. Because each time it went through there, it added 1 to that. And we could change that code around a little more. We could add this print x at each loop. You could even do that. And notice I have to indent it, and those indents are critical. So when I try to cut and paste things, that's where I will end up with a lot of trouble if I try to do this. So let's run it now. Yes, I want to save it. And so now it shows me as it's counting up, it's alive, it's alive, it's alive, it's alive. So we can use these loops for a lot of different conditions. The for loop is kind of our easy one. Now, the one that seems kind of a mystery, at least in this point, for each pass in range. Do we use each pass? So let's just out of curiosity, let's see what variable is stored in there. So I'm going to run it again. And it stores the value 4. Oh, wait a minute. Hang on, guys. Why would it store the value 4? Because it says for each pass in range, so this value increments every time it goes through, and it ends at 4. Why would that end at 4? It started at 0. So 0 to 4 is 5 iterations. So when I did my plus 1, I put it at the bottom of that loop, so it added my 1 in there. So we have to be careful that we realize that it always starts at 0 when it counts. So it does 5 iterations, but it starts at 0 through 4. So if I want to use that value, that variable for something, I have to be aware of what it's going to do. Well, there's a lot of different ways to do this. Can I do this? Well, let's try it. So, no, it's not going to like that one. So we have to kind of figure out the formula for here, but those for loops are really nice. If I know ahead of time how many loops I'm going to do, a for loop works really, really nice. So they show us a couple of other ones. So here we use it in a range of an exponent. Okay. We can put in a variable in for that. It doesn't have to be a hard-coded number. That could be another variable. So here they're showing how to do exponents, but they're doing it with using a loop. Well, okay, so we could do that. Here's one that counts through ranges of numbers. So here we can do it. So we can't do it with a hyphen, but notice what we can do. We can do a comma to separate those. Let me get back to my loop. So if I wanted to do 1 through 5 explicitly, if I separate them with a comma, I could actually do this. And there it goes specifically through 1 through 5. But something really weird happens when I do that. So here I said I'm going to use that value for each pass. When I do that with upper and lower bounds, notice what's really weird. It gives me a 0 inside each loop. So we have to be a little careful about what we're getting back out of there. So you have to make sure you know what you're doing with these loops. So there's a lot of different assignment operators we can use. So I will say that one of the things that I tend to do is I write my stuff out just slightly different than what our book is going to show you. And it's probably because I'm old and been doing coding for a while. I don't like the shortcuts. So instead of saying a plus equals 3, so what it's really equivalent to is saying is a equals a plus 3, I type that out. So in other words, if I want to add a variable every time this loop runs, and I want to use the one a, so a equals a plus 3 or whatever it is, I could just say a plus equals 3. And it does the same thing. It saves a couple of keystrokes, and this is kind of the current contemporary way to do it. I'm old, and I like to just write it that way. I remember what I'm actually doing. So a equals a plus 3. A plus 3 is added on the right-hand side and then shoves back in to a. So every time that loop runs, it adds in a number of variables in there. All right, so that's one of the differences that you're going to see in the book and from what we sometimes do in here. So here we have that idea of we're off by 1 because we think, obviously, that we start counting 1, 2, 3. And if we don't do it with a set range, then we're going to have something a little different. All right. We can also do this with a list, which is interesting, and we haven't really talked about this idea of a data sequence yet, but here's a group of data, 1, 2, 3, 4. We can actually traverse through those, and you'll see we'll get through some of those, and it'll be a little more interesting as we go through those. We can certainly count down. So here we have a loop from 10 to 0, and you go by -1. So there's some ways we can manipulate those loops around. Well, I'm going to jump back over to this extra book we've got. So I'm going to ask you to open this Python Programming for Absolute Beginners. And let's see if it opens up there for me. Somewhere there we go. Okay. So we're going to try to create a Guess My Number game. So this Guess My Number game, so you've all played those. Try to guess a number between 1 and 100. Try to guess it in as few attempts as possible. Okay, so we've all played something like that. If you haven't, then your childhood wasn't complete. I'm certain that everybody has played something like that. second. Oop. All right. So this guess my number game, we need a couple of other things that we don't have yet in there. And one of them we don't have yet is we don't have any way to get a random number. And so we need to figure out how to get a random number. Well, in Python, if let me exit this program, and I want to type random. Oh, it doesn't like random. Oh, name random's not defined. Maybe just ran? Ran? Oh, man. Okay. So the trick to this is we actually have to do that importing of a library. So if I import random, so now we've imported that library for random numbers. And so now if I type random, it says, oh, are you trying to get it from this library? And it actually shows where it's stored. So our program has to do a couple of things. We're going to have to get a random number, and we're going to have to generate it. And we know that we want a number between 1 and 100. We're going to have to get an input, and we're going to have to guess each time and try to narrow it down. So there's a lot of little pieces in here, so I think it makes sense to look at it on kind of that pseudocode side to kind of think about the logic of something like this. So this is our guess my number game. And so just so we can keep track of it, numbers 1 through 100. So at the very top, I know that one of the first things I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to import random library. So going to have to do that. No other way around it, unfortunately. All right. So we're going to import our random library. Next, we're going to have to generate random number from 1 to 100. Okay. Next, we're going to probably want to do something called start our loop. Because in that loop, we're going to get an input, and then we're going to compare input to random number. And you're going to output some advice. And then you're going to return or start that loop. Does that make sense? So we're going to get a number. We're going to start this loop. We're going to keep asking until they're done. And when they're done, so if those numbers are equal, we need to exit that loop. So we've got a lot of little pieces going on in here. Well, there's also a matter of something called structured programming we have to address just a little bit. And so before we do anything else, we're going to have to do something, and we're going to call this priming the pump. So if you've been on a farm or you've used a water pump, you know that you have to add some water to it before you can ever start that pump to cycle. Well, we're doing something very similar. And here we're going to input. So this is kind of odd. We're going to get the input from our user about what their guess is. And then we're going to start the loop. So we'll explain why here as we go through this a little bit. So we get an input. We start a loop, and at the very beginning of the loop, rather than get input, what we're really going to do is compare if numbers match. So if you, at the very first guess, get it correct. So if you guessed correct, exit loop. So let's go through and look at how we can actually build this. So here's kind of our, like a generalization of what we might want to do. And then we will so here's a built example to kind of show you what it will look like. So I'm thinking of a number between 1 and 100. So if we're logical, what's our first guess going to be? 50, or somewhere right in the middle. So we split it, and it says higher. So we're going to split the difference again, and we guessed it. Now, kind of weird, but we managed to do that right away. Usually you're not going to get it in that number of guesses. So we're going to create a couple of things. So to get to the idea of this random number generator, I want to look at how to roll craps. Has anybody went to a casino and played craps? But don't tell me. I don't want to know. You all understand the idea of craps, right? Just say, yeah, that's kind of weird. Why is my instructor trying to teach us to gamble? So I'm going to come over here on my shell, and I'm going to start a brand new program. And moving in the right window. And so this program I'm going to call dice. And I'm going to make sure I have my name in it. And because I know I'm going to do this a lot, I'm going to say import random. All right. So that says, hey, we've loaded in something already. So I'm going to say die. And because I maybe want to use more than one, I'm going to say die1. And I'm going to assign it a value. And I'm going to say random.rand integer. All right. So random says, hey, we're accessing this library or that function, and we're using our dot notation, random integer, and I'm going to say that I want numbers between 1 and 6. So that makes sense, doesn't it? So we're going to get values, and then I'm going to print all right, so if I run this, and before I run it, it's going to say, hey, I need to save it, and I got to go back to my documents and go to my Python files and call it dice. So when I run that, it says it gives me a number 4. If I run it again, it gives me 5. If I run it again, hopefully it'll give me a different number. Oh, not 5, F5. Yep, all right. So it gives me a set of numbers between 1 and 6. So that works kind of handy. Well, maybe I want to do something more like craps. So if you've played craps, you roll 2 dice. So 2 dice would be, so let's go die 2. Now, I could use the same thing, but I also want to look at one other way to do it. So I'm still using random dot rand range, and I'm going to say I want it to 6. And so now I'm going to print die1 and I'm going to do a print die 2. So now I have 2 dice, and I'm going to run this. All right, hang on. How long before it's going to show me what I wanted to see? Perfect. All right. So when I ran it the second time, it said first dice was 6, the second dice was 0. How did it get 0? Oh yeah, it starts counting at 0. So this gives me choices of 6 positions. So it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the quick way to fix that, if I want to use this, is simply tack on a 1 at the end. And so now it'll be 1 through 6. Does that make sense? So different ways to do the same thing. So now I have 3, 2, 4, 1. So you could also do something like total equals die 1 plus die 2. And then you could print total. So now, I crapped out. I rolled a 7. So you could start making some games like this, because now, hey, we can put random numbers in. Okay, that's pretty cool. This is the way we can get random numbers. And we use them in a lot of games and a lot of our, if we're doing Monte Carlo simulations. Here's the one thing I'm going to warn you about. The way that we get random numbers is less than random. So it generates a number that to us is random, but if we were actually looking at this over time and over millions of runs, we might be able to figure out how that number is started, and we would see that it's not truly as random as possible. So Python, just using the random library, I wouldn't run a casino with it. But it might be an interesting way to begin our adventure. So we're going to start here. And so in the book here, they talk about a craps roller program, and they show you how to go through and do that. I encourage you to do this because they explain really nicely how they're doing it and how the random integer works. All right. But we have one more thing we need to do before we get here very far. And that is, we need to be able to use a statement that does some comparisons and lets us make some choices for those comparisons. So the next one is something called a password program they're going to introduce us to. And in this one, we're going to talk about this if statement. So that if statement, we can use it in Excel, you can use it in almost everything, and you know how it works. We just have to throw that into your brain. So if I open up Excel, let me make it a little bigger for everybody to see it. So if I put a value in here of 45, I can actually write an if statement. So if I start typing equals if, oh, look, it tells me something. It checks whether a condition is met and returns one value if true and another value if false. So these are really very similar functions to what you're going to run. So I'm going to say if this cell is greater than, let's go 70. And so you're going to get a value if true. You pass. And then a value if false. You fail. So we can do this in Excel. Yes, I'll accept that. All right. So right now it says, hey, you fail, right? Because 45 is less. Well, let's see if I type in 75 or whatever it is. That's, gee, Christmas. 81, you pass. 44. Now, here's where one subtle little piece happens. So if I type in 70 exactly, am I going to get a fail or a pass? What do we think? How many think we're going to fail and how many think we're going to pass? How many fail? How many think it's going to pass? Because it's 70, right? Oh, Why does it still say I'm failing? So let's take a look at that very carefully. It says if G5 is greater than 70. Is 70 greater than 70? No. So to really do this, sometimes we have to put in a greater than or equals to. So now if I do that, notice I pass now. 69, I fail. 70, I pass. So it's either greater than or equal to 70, and so we use that a lot. So I actually did that many years ago. I put in a big formula for converting grades so I could just see a letter. And I did that. I screwed up. I forgot to put the or the equals and or. So only if you got over a 90 did you get an A. A 90 itself got you a B+. So I had to go through and revise those. So we're going to do the same thing here. We're just going to ask it, hey, is this the right password? So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to go File, New. And I'm going to write a new one here. And so I'm going to use this nomenclature here. So I'm going to call this password. And I'm going to call this my name. That way I know what it is. And I'm going to shorten this a little bit, just because, for the sake of expediency. Welcome to Security Inc. And I'm going to put in a couple spaces to bring it down. And I'm going to put in password equals input. Enter your password. And then I'm going to come down here and I'm going to do an if statement. So this is the first time we've done an if statement. So this will be exciting and new. So if, and notice it color codes it, password is equal to. And notice for the equals, I have to use the double equal sign. A single equal says I'm assigning a value. Double equals is a asking if they're equal. So I'm going to type the same thing. So I'm just going to set it equal to secret. I'm going to hit my colon. And when I enter, then I'm going to be down inside another block. So just like we looked really quickly with the loop and with our other stuff, I've created a block now. And if that condition is true, are granted now. We don't have anything to do if it's false, right? Right now, we don't have any way to do it if it's false. But I want to see if that condition works. So if I run this, and I'm going to have to call it something, so call it password. So enter your password. And notice it just exits out because I didn't get the right word. So if I run it again, now it says you're granted access. So I can control what happens in this block of code based on an if statement. So the same way we did in Excel here, if this condition is true, then I run this piece. So we're very similar in our structure here. You're granted access. Yay! So now we can use an if statement. And so it's a really, really short program. Now, and they get, which I think is kind of interesting. No, you're not going to use something that simple when you do that. So they talk about comparison operators, and I think it gives a little better explanation here. So equal to, not equal to, greater than, less than, greater than or equal, less than or equal. So make sure you've looked at this. And we can even, one of the interesting things, because those strings really translate back to that ASCII key codes, we can actually compare them to compare strings. Talks about our blocks, and then says here you can build your own. So there's our input program. There is another piece then. And remember in Excel here, I had two conditions possible. So I had, if this is true, then this happens, else the value here happens. Well, Python does the same thing, and we can actually put in something here. So instead of we come back on the outside line, else, colon, and our new line is print so I can do an else statement also, or a whole set of them. So this part happens if it's true, else this happens. So now if I run this, and I say my password is SEC, and it says wrong password, go away. Because I got it wrong, it said, oh, nope, we're going to loop down to this particular one. All right, so we're getting closer to having all those tools. We know how to do a little bit of a loop, but we only know how to do a for loop. So we may need to brush up just a little more. So there's some other ones in here. So here we did a random to see about your mood, and we did some examinations. And they showed us one more condition. So not only can we do an else, we can actually do an elif. And we can do elifs for a whole lot of different conditions. But we're not quite where we want to be yet. We'll have to figure out some of those pieces. All right. So let's take a look back at our original attempt here. So if now I'm starting to see, okay, this is how I could do one piece. I could get my number. So in this case, it says, all right, it took 5 tries. So we need to probably, let me run that again. Nope. All right, so we need to go back and probably look at this a little bit and see what else we can do. So I'm going to come back in, and I'm going to start creating a new one. So I'm going to create a new file. And I'm going to create this file, and I'm going to call it guess my number. And I'm going to save this right away so I know where it's at. Same area I've got all my other Python files. So one of the things I saw when people were turning in files also is you were putting spaces in there. And Windows will ignore spaces, but it's better to not do that and keep it all one line. Guess my number. And so there I just camel cased it so we can save it. All right. So we know we have a couple of things that we can do already. I know up here at the beginning I need to import random. Well, I can put in some print statements and I can kind of explain what's going on. welcome to guess my number. Explain a little bit about the details. You will guess a number that is from 1 to 100. So you can get a little bit of information in there. So I need to pick a random number. And so I need to think about some of these initial variables. So I'm just going to call it number. I'm going to say that's going to be equal to, remember we can do our random dot, and so we could do it either way. Because we can do the rand integer, and notice it helpfully pops this up there, and between two numbers, I could actually say 100. And that's going to generate a value so that's going to initiate a value that's going to be between 1 and 100. Because I think it's just going to be a guess, I'm just going to use the word guess equals input, take a guess. Now, this is not what we call that priming the pump. It's outside of our loop when we get the first value. Yeah. We also want to keep track of how many tries they do. So I could just simply say try equals 1, because the minimum they're ever going to do is 1 try. All right. I have one other thing I have that we need to think about here. And that is, I'm taking in a number, and remember it's always going to be an integer, or it's always going to be a string, and we need to convert it then to an integer. So int, I'm going to convert that to an integer. And so my first thing I'm going to go do through here is now I'm going to have these pieces. And I may put in a print statement just to see what my number is. And I'm going to run this just to see where I'm at right now. See what happens. So, invalid syntax. What did I do up above, probably? Make sure that's not a number that's being reserved. Every once in a while you run into a variable, especially if you're doing short ones, that is a reserved item. And in that case, it apparently was. Welcome to Guess My Number. You will guess the numbers from 1 to 100. Take a guess. Now, it doesn't actually do anything. We don't have any code in here yet. But I guessed 20, and it actually says it's 6. So, normally we wouldn't have this print the actual number right out, but I want to make sure that it gets a random number. And so if I run it again, it gives me 24. So it's generating a set of numbers. So I'm going to use this, but I'm going to just go ahead and remark that out, because we might want to use that for testing later. So I get my number, I get a guess, I get a try. I need to create a loop. We looked at for loops, but what I'm going to do is something a little different called a while loop. So a while loop is typically how we start a loop we don't know how many times we're going to run. So a while loop says, while some condition is true, this loop will continue to run. So the first thing I'm going to say is while guess. So the loop is based on a condition, honestly. It says, while this condition is not true, then I'm going to run. So while guess does not equal, what do we call ours, number? Chunk. Now, everything inside of here is going to run. As long as those two values aren't the same, this is going to run forever. And so I can print let's just print a number, guess. So inside of here, notice it forms a bracket. And I want to see if this really does just run forever. Because I have nothing to change the guess and the number. So unless I guess this the very first time, that should run like that forever. Because what we created was something called an infinite loop. And if I do that, I can do a Control-C to pop it. And what it says was, and if I look at this, it's just going to continue this loop because guess is never going to change in any way to get closer to number. So I'm going to take that statement back out for a minute. And I want to come up with some that says, all right, I need some information back. So I'm one level in, and I'm going to use an if statement. So if guess is greater than number, and notice now I'm going to be indented 2 levels. I'm going to print, because what we're saying is the number that we're guessing is higher than what our actual number is. We're just going to say lower. And now we can go back 1 indent level and do the else. Print higher. Because there's only 2 conditions. If it's the same, then it's going to not run this loop, and it'll be at the bottom of that loop. So the other piece we need to do then is I need to now get this guess again. So I'm going to copy this because, why not? And it's going to be at this level of the while loop. And I'm going to ask for their input again. All right. And so when it's done, it should actually exit out. So let's see what happens if I run this as is. 1 to 100. So I'm going to say 50. Higher. Oh. Lower. So it must have been 60 because it exited out of that loop. Otherwise, this will run forever. So if I run it again, so now we know it's a different number. And in this case, it was 43. We don't get all our interesting information out. So we now need to add a little more pieces to this. So if we come out of that loop, we know that you guessed the right number. So you could say print, congratulations, you guessed the right number. And then you could actually put out that number. The number was number. So now it's going to output that number and tell you that. So run module. Congratulations, you passed the right number. Obviously, my typing is horrible in here, but all right. So we can get the right number. The other piece we have then is we want to see how many times this loops through, And so I can simply add equals plus 1. And now as it exits that loop, you did it. So now, I've taken this simple program, I've made it a little more user-friendly. Take a guess. You guessed the right number, and you did it in 10 number of turns. So, grammar skills not the greatest on there, but we can take a fairly simple program here, and we can continue to add pieces onto it. So, really quickly, we have showed you two different kinds of loops. So, we showed you a while loop, so while a condition is true, and we showed you a for loop. A for loop is always a set number of times. So it's very handy, but there's different purposes for both kinds of loops. So if I want to print something out a specific number of times, that for loop is really handy. This is handy, the while loop, if I have a condition that's changing. And I need to make sure that I have a couple of these pieces in here. I need to have where my value is changeable so that there's some way out of that loop. So this is where we're going to land off for today. Make sure you have read chapter in the original book, and I would really encourage you reading this, Python Programming for the Absolute Beginner. There's some differences in content. In other words, they'll show one piece or another, but I think this is a really great way to do it. Work alongside these. This class is one where if you do not try things, you are not going to succeed. So this I thought might be a great help, and we all like to play games, even if it's just guessing my number. You can also try things out in Excel. A lot of the same things, guess my number, sure, why not? A lot of the same things we're learning here, you can actually run. So these if-then statements, you can learn some really interesting things in Excel and be able to do them. So here you could certainly tell if somebody was passing or failing. Which is kind of neat to do on an Excel sheet if you haven't ever had the chance to do one like that. All right, so let me find my class, which is somewhere buried in here. Hold on. I lost my class. I have 757 more windows open than what I need. Oh, maybe I accidentally closed our class. Nope. There it is. Way too many things open. All right, so make sure you read for the next couple of weeks this about loops. There's a couple of videos that I think are useful. We'll go over some truth tables. You'll see we have a list of assignments, and we'll go through some of those. And I've made another link to a looping chapter just in case you want that. And so I have some other pieces to look at as we go through here. This really starts adding a lot of complexity, a lot of functionality, but it's starting to get where you'll also make some mistakes. All of us have, all of us will, and you'll have to figure out then how to correct those mistakes. So hang in there. Make sure you read this to start with. There is a discussion board for the next week. So somewhere around here I have kind of an extra credit discussion board. So make sure that you've posted on that and get some extra credit points. All right, any questions? Anybody tired of hearing me talk?